guys, so we're on the guest book, page 29. Kitty woke in the earliest part of the morning, her heart pounding. Nettie needed her somewhere and quickly. Where or why, she never knew. Though the dream was always the same, the dream never left traces like other dreams. They were never a moment in the waking day when something left over would glide through the air. When she catched it and remember, oh, that's what it was, that was the dream. This one came and sought her, and she started running in her sleep, running in the grip of a nameless fear toward him to get him. Lying on her back, she put up a hand up to her forehead and felt the sweat. Her eyes adjusted to the dark in the room, and the shape of Ogden's body beside her rose like a soft wall between her and the drop of the bed, the window beyond, a comforting dark, a quickening one. She lay there, but the dream had been different somehow. She tried to pull it back as her heart slowed. It hadn't been Nettie, it had been someone else, some other child she must get to, some other child she needed help, who needed help. She lay there, a breeze coming up from the water pulling through the window at the door of the bed, blowing the shade forward toward her. Who? She couldn't recall. She knew if she slid off the bed to lift the shade and look, there would be no light in the sky. During the moonless nights of the month here on the island, night was pitch black and fathomless, as if colored by a child, but full of sound, trees shifting in the wind and their boughs sighed. On windless nights, when the trees were still, one could hear the tide pulling back and forth, combing over the black rocks in the cove. The only animal on the move, full of the same silent sound as the rocks and trees, were bats, winging in tight circles above the barn. The sweat cooled, and she pulled the comforter up and closed around her neck and chest. Ogden rolled over and put his warm hand on her collarbone. All right, he murmured, half awake. Yes, she whispered. Go back to sleep, he grunted. Already gone. Moss, that was it. Had it been moss? It must have been. Something she had seen last night must have set off this panic. Something so small. She wasn't sure she could find the word that would haul it up to the surface. So she could think about what she had seen, understand it somehow, name it. It was his toast, wasn't it? Or it happened before the toast, something he had said in the middle of a conversation. It was the way he stood from the table, wasn't it? The way he had stood as if she searched, thinking of Moss moving off toward the swinging door, nodding sure Dickie politely before disappearing outside. What was outside that couldn't be found in here? Kitty turned on her side, away from Ogden, so she could think in the dark. As if he wanted to flee the table. Why? A dinner like that, with so many old friends who shared so many meals up there. And then again, down in the city, carried the world in it, carried the ease of the world, all the givens. Ogden at one end of the table, herself at the other. The guests ranged around the sides, the planets. She'd like to ask a question from her end and watch the men take off. She liked that she knew enough to follow where they led, to make sure this conversation stayed its course, to divert it when the course was fraught. She'd never take up the argument, but she wrote it. She made certain it kept up its paces. When a man refuses to take up the bit, it shook her. When a man neglected his duties. Failing to fill someone's glass when it was empty, failing to be the host, it was a sign that something had gone off, something had slipped, and Moss had stepped out of the circle around the table. Moss had ducked the halter. She set up. The faintest glimmer of light rimmed the shades. The flashlight on the nightstand was heavy and cool in her grip, and she pointed it to the floor and stood up in the beam. There would be no more sleep tonight. In the In the mudroom downstairs, she fished at a wool coat off its hook and a hat and pulled on the tall rubber boat she used to pick mussels. It was still night outside, though a paler shade of dark. Softly, she made her way through the dining room and the pantry and toward the dim glimmer of the pilot light under the burner of the stove. She turned the knob, and the flame thrust its blue claw above the iron burner. In the big dormitory room over the kitchen, Moss turned in his sleep. She reached for the kettle, set it on the flame, and picked up a tea bag out of the canister, setting it into a teacup. Kitty pulled the coat closer around her nightgown, waiting for the kettle to boil. The urgency on Moss' face had frightened her last night. He had seemed almost desperate. And that smile, that crooked grin that stole over him, he had been all dunk, she realized, standing there. Moss had never quite taken, never gelled. He had a gift for people, a gift for gathering strangers together. He always had, but there was something missing, a rope that had never found its ring. She folded her arms over her chest. Moss was not dunk. The kettle started the roll before it squealed, and she snapped the flame off, reaching for the cup and set it on the counter, pouring the hot water. Now the pale glow of the big rock began to show through. It would be dawn soon. There was something coming, something she couldn't fully see, yet an argument whose words she couldn't quite make out behind closed doors and felt therefore powerless to effect. Overhead there was a quiet thud. Then 2 feet climbed over the side of the bed and onto the floor. Kitty waited. Moss would be sitting down the narrow stairs, most probably to find the bathroom at the end of the hall. She picked up the teacup and headed for the kitchen door. As the footsteps crossed, the door opened and she pushed through the screen and out into the morning. A low, dense fog hung above the lawn, heavy with dew. Ogden's clear day, the promise of the day offered by last night's star-struck clarity, had shrouded. She walked forward into the paler gray that was the air, distinguished from the dark shapes of the spruce at the water's edge. The first of the engines hummed just past that point as someone hauled his pots in the thick damp. When fog wrapped the trees and stalled in the air like this, it used to frighten Moss so. He used to see people flashing in and out of the dark trunks. No, you don't, Kitty. He tried to soothe him. Of course you don't. But he would stand there patiently, standing upstairs hall, looking at this single frame window, her boy in his short pants, his hair combed, his teeth brushed, his back straight, as he waited for the ghosts from the woods, as though he was watching. He could protect them all. Kitty shivered. There were the shadows underneath the spots of time. Or rather, there was a spot in time up here that did not hold sunlight or square dances or weddings or the other children running down the hill to catch the boat. It drifted up to the surface of memory only when a certain present stumbled across the past and called it up. That morning, Moss had wandered down the hill in the fog toward the boathouse, holding Joni's hand, following Ogden. It had seemed to be 1 minute, Kitty had said, "Okay, dearie," from where she was bent among the roses, and the next minute she looked up and there was Ogden carrying the little boy in his arms up the hill, and Moss was running toward her, dripping wet and sobbing. It was Joni. Ogden was carrying Joni in his arms. Water was pouring off his shirt. "We need a doctor. Was all Ogden said. Kitty dropped to her trowel. "Mom," Moss cried. She turned around and held open her arms. "Come on, love," she whispered. "We need a blanket." Joni was shaking. Moss turned his blue lips to his mother. She fell. In the water, Kitty could barely breathe. "I couldn't stop it, Mom. I couldn't stop. She was going under, and I saw her face." "It's all right, Moss." Kitty pulled open the front door, still holding his hand, and then climbed the stairs together to the linen closet where she grabbed several towels. I couldn't do anything, Moss trembled. She sank to her knees and folded him in a towel. Her proud little boy, her stalwart. Oh, Kitty, pause now. Her mind ran up against that morning again. It had been so long ago, all that. She walked through the boathouse and out onto the dock, where the fog hung loose upon the water, upon the dark angle of the roof running down into the wide granite rock that formed the tip of the cove. Water dripped from the floorboards of the boathouse onto the rocks. She worried about Joan. Everyone did. The doctors had warned that if fit could take her any time. She might drown or crash a car. She might fall down in the middle of the street. She ought never marry. It wouldn't be fair to ask of a man, unless it was someone who knew her, unless it was Fino. Kitty searched for the Wells dog across the way, but the fog was in too thick. She had always liked him. Fino knew all about the Fitz. Fino would be kind. There were footsteps coming through the boathouse and then out onto the pier behind her. Someone paused at the top of the gangway, and she turned around. "You're up early," she said. "Something woke me." Moss yawned, pulling open the gate and patting down the gangway in his bare feet. "Thick a fog," he pronounced. She nodded. "Evelyn will be worried about people coming tonight. It'll burn off, perhaps." They stood together, quiet. In the quiet, "I was just thinking how it used to be to frighten you." He thrust his hands deep into his pockets and nodded. "Fog always seems like it's waiting to get you." "Tell me something," she said after a while. He looked at her. "What on earth were you talking about last night? Which part?" Looking backward, she shrugged. "Why are we here? How did we get here?" She frowned. "Here, on the island." "No, Mum, here. To this point in time. The situation with the Negroes." Dad was talking as if it didn't matter what the television show was called, just that the blacks were sounding off. He shook his head. "But why are they sounding off?" "It's the why that has us here." "But where was here?" she wondered, bewildered. What was he talking about? His row would be harder to till, she thought apprehensively. He was making it more difficult for himself with these interests, the passions. He had a harder time slipping into work for Og. "Enter every room with a smile," she said. "Speak to everyone regardless of their place, as another human being, a reasonable person, as to create an atmosphere of goodwill. That is the best defense against people who haven't been brought up to know better. You just leave them alone. No one can touch you then, and you show others the way to be. Lead by example." He nodded, unconvinced. She paused. Of course, they didn't like being treated badly. No one does. But these things take time. They take patience. But patience, she wanted to shake him just that hard. He had the same overabundance of conscience as Duck had. Responsibility was not an absolute. We were kind, we were generous, but we did not owe more than we could give. "Moss," she said sharply, "why identify yourself?" So, he shook his head. What else is there? And something in his face, the careless confusion, called back the moment so long ago. The boy who did not see the danger turning to her in front of that window. She shuddered. "Moss," she rested her hand on his arm, frightened. "I mean it. I know you do," he said, and gave her out the sweetest smile and turned away. The fog had come in and sunk down. Joan saw with satisfaction lying back on the pillow. She loved the fog. She looked up at the ceiling, pictured the men in the North Haven right now, who pulled out their chairs and their straight edge and were plotting the course over here. Those who were coming would stay the night, which meant she rolled over. They'd be mattresses to pull and sheets and blankets to haul up to the barn. It was delicious, a party that would begin with dinner and drinks, move to dancing, and then last right through the dark, and then less and less right through the dark. Anne lay profoundly asleep in the four-poster next to hers. Joan pushed the pink covers off and sat up. Her eyes rested on her shorts, folded over the arm of the wicker chair at the foot of the bed. Her sneakers pushed in underneath, dutiful as a child. She brushed the floor with the soles of her feet and stood behind her nightgown over her head in one long motion. Her nipples rose and she cupped them, imagining Len's hands on her waist pulling her into him. Len, she caught sight of herself in a little mirror above the bureau, drew and shivered at the clear longing in her eyes. Len Levy, of course people will come, she said to Evelyn, who was standing at the bottom of the stairs, staring out the screen door into the fog. Moss and Mum were walking slowly through the gloom, Moss' white shirt glowing against the gray. Evelyn turned around and looked at Joan gratefully. Do you think so, really? I do, said Joan. They're mad for stuff like that over there, a test of valor and all that. She rolled her eyes and Evelyn smiled. Hello, Mom, she said. Good morning, Kitty answered. Is there coffee for the Pratts? Maid? They aren't up yet, Joan said, but she picked up the kettle and filled it with water. Dickie was up and toasting bread over the open burner, watching with suspicion by Jessie. Don't worry, he said to her cheerfully. I'm a professional. There was much to be done before the party. The rowboats would need to be pumped out and then pulled off into the cove to make room for the boats for the North Haven and Final Haven. But first, Kitty warned, we'll need to figure out about the piano, how to get it up that hill. Oh God, Moss groaned. The piano was an upright, a Steinway that one of Kitty's aunts had left her after the war. They had brought it across on the gas boat and then wheeled it up the lawn on a wooden dolly, getting it inside the house with considerable effort. Kitty had long planned to take it to the next distance up to the barn, and the promise of so many young men handy for the job made it impossible not to do, even as it seemed well nigh impossible to push a quarter ton of mahogany steel buckskin and glue up a hill pocketed by voles. The improbability of it made it just the kind of plan Ogden relished. And on the foggy day, provided that all the physical challenges equal to and more useful than a walk in the woods, which Ogden had also suggested for the morning. How were you thinking of doing it? Moss asked. With a dolly, just as before, she answered. What dolly? The one that went over the side of the dock years ago. Ogden frowned. He's right. Do you remember? Kitty shook her head. It should be easy enough to ring something else up, Dickie said, as he appeared in the dining room. If you've got a wheelbarrow and some board, Ogden turned, you have got a plan. Dickie grinned, always. Moss rolled his eyes at Joan. Good man, Ogden said. Go on then. We'll still have to manhandle it onto the wheelbarrow and then down the steps. Manhandle Evelyn. Evelyn chirped from the kitchen. I like it. This is all for you, Ev. You realize, Moss called me. This is Mom's idea. It's your party, yours and Dickie's. Don't give me that. Evelyn paused. You have the whole barn now to play in without anyone listening. I like people listening. Do people? Go on, Ogden said. You better get cracking if we're going to get it up the hill by sunset. Well, get it up there. Don't worry. We'll get it up there. Don't worry, Mr. Milton. Dickie appeared behind Evelyn's, towering over her head. I'll get these guys moving like a team. A manhandling team. Evelyn tossed at him over her shoulder as he gave her a squeeze and went on. The screen door slammed. Joan came through the kitchen door with bayberry she had cut from the big patch out back, and Kitty held out her hands to take it. I hate bayberry, Evelyn remarked idly. Why do you always choose bayberry when there's so much else out there? Kitty set the greens down on the dining room table and looked at the youngest daughter. If you can't say anything nice, Joan took the copper pitcher at the center of the table with her into the pantry, where she filled it with water from the sink. Don't say it, Evelyn groaned. I know. Joan turned off the tap and dried her hands on her shorts. Kitty held the cutting shears and motioned Joan to set the pitcher on the table in front of her. Mutinous, Evelyn folded her arms against the silent agreement between her mother and her sister. There was wild yarrow, Scotch, heather, anything but the bayberry. But Joan's idea was always seconded by their mother. She was the favorite, the pearl. But Mum. Kitty raised her eyes and looked at Evelyn. Why choose to keep what everyone else she was going to say to herself? Evelyn, who chose to keep whatever else she was going to say to herself. Beds, Joan suggested. Shall we pull out the blankets and pillows and bring them up the barn? Good idea, Kitty nodded, beginning to stuff the bayberry branch by branch into the vase's narrow mouth. Beneath her hands, a green bouquet grew. Cantilevered over the lip of the copper filled the room with a sharp smell. Kitty set the pitcher at the table and then swept the cutting into the waste basket she had brought in from the front room. There, she smiled at the arrangement. Anne Pratt woke up at last, and she helped the sister drag all the bedding they could find out of the linen closet, folding it neatly on the spare bed in the upstairs front room. Hudson Bay wool blankets from Granny Hunton's camp in the Adirondacks, down pillows, pillowcases, and cast-off sheets from the Oswald Club. After a little while, the men's voices snaked through the fog and the open window as they returned from the boathouse and lay abroad boards across the granite steps in front. Moss was in high spirits, and the girls heard them tramp through the front door and down the hall to the living room. Fog is thicker than ever, he called to the house. The opening chords of the song reached through the house to where the three young women stood, and the slow, bewildered strain of So in Love climbed as Moss sang above the notes he played. Strange, dear, but true, dear. Joan smiled at Anne, who had snuck down into the flooded sheets to listen. It was something about how slow the song was, the mood of it, perplexed and thoughtful, not gay, not the usual Cole Porter. When I'm close to you, dear, the low thread of longing that ran through it suited the thick air, the sense of a party coming, of something about to happen. Joan folded the blankets in her arms and then hugged it. Her father's voice cut in, and Moss' hands came abruptly off the keys. Joan, her mother called from another part of the house. Joan, coming. She called back. The bell on the dock clanged down into the cove. Girls, Kitty Milton called to them as they rounded the top of the stairs. Go and see who that is, will you? And then bring them up here. Joan nodded, and she and Anne came down the stairs and out the front door and into the fog-bound morning. Somewhere out into the Narrows, the low thrum of a boat's engine flared and caught and pulled away in the invisible ocean. The scattered gray humps of the granite and the lawn vanished into the air. Even the bright green of the grass seemed to have turned its color down. Who on earth got through this pea soup? Anne wondered aloud. I'm telling you, these sailors up here are mad. Joan smiled and walked forward into the gray. Anywho, said Anne, I meant to ask, do you have your own checking account? Yes, Joan glanced at her, of course. Well, of course nothing. Mum thinks it's dangerous to give me one, that I'll have one soon enough when I'm married, and I'm not sure, but I don't agree. Maybe it's best to leave it with the men, she mused. We don't ask them to make a holiday Joan snorted. For God's sake, prattle, it's 1959. We've got washing machines and dryers. We've got no wax vinyl floors. You ought to have your own checking account. Don't you want to be practical? Of course I want to be practical, Anne returned cheerfully. I want to be more than that. I think marriage ought to run on two rails, his and hers, without dripping your finger into each other's pots. That way you can concentrate on loving each other. Love involves pot dipping. Joan tossed back, smiling. At least the love I want. Other than Anne's feet right behind hers in the moss, there wasn't a sound. It seemed they were walking straight through a cloud. It was impossible to see farther than 5 feet in front of them. And when the gray shadow of the boathouse loomed ahead of them, Joan almost started. And amour moins on se parlait, maix mux on se comprehend, Anne pronounced grandly. That makes no sense to me whatsoever, Joan retorted, smiling. I would think you'd want to be talking all the damn time, otherwise you'd be bored each other to tears. They had passed through the gray wooden room and out again into the vapor on the other side, making their way to the end of the pier and looking down. And then standing at the end of the dock with the back to them was Len. Beside him stood a black man with a camera. Oh, Joan stopped, weak at the sight of him. No, she thought, not here, not here. I'm not ready. A Negro, whispered Anne. Come on. Joan walked forward as naturally as she could and put a smile on. The guest book, 30, chapter 30. The wind had come up suddenly and the waves crashed over the dinghy, with its one little sail skimming across the water at a terrifying clip. She wasn't sure how long she could hold on to the main street if the wind kept blowing across the bow, the strong, and at the same time she couldn't let go. She had fallen behind the rest of the sailing across the turn of waves. Talking badly, the lines getting caught through the pulleys. The water was pooling at the bottom of the dinghy, and the sea was slippery and wet.